To Ukraine now, where top commander Oleksandr Syrskyi says Kyiv has set up a military office in Russia's Kursk region while its forces are continuing to advance. He claims Ukraine is in control of dozens of settlements spanning more than 1,100 square kilometers of Russian territory. Kyiv says it plans to use the occupied area as a strategic buffer zone to protect its border region from Russian attacks. In the past 10 days, Ukraine has carried out the biggest attack on Russian soil since the Second World War. Ukraine launched its incursion into Russia from the border region of Sumy, which sits directly across from the Kursk region. Our correspondent Nick sent us this update from there.
This is where Ukraine's incursion into Russia began just over a week ago. Where I'm standing here is still Ukrainian territory. Behind me, you can see the destroyed border post. And 10 kilometers down the road is the Russian town of Sudzha, where, if social media videos are to be believed, the Ukrainian flag is already flying. For now, it's comparatively quiet here, but we can hear artillery fire in the distance. Evacuated Ukrainian residents of the villages along this border have told us that whereas before they had over the past 2 years had Russian artillery, Russian drones just on this other side of the border attacking them, now those Russian boots on the ground have been replaced by Russian planes in the sky armed with very dangerous glide bombs. On the road we've just driven here from Sumy, we saw countless Ukrainian military vehicles, all bearing that very characteristic triangle marking that has been the characteristic of this incursion into Russia. And we saw lots of ambulances, military ambulances coming from Russia back into Ukrainian-held territory in the other direction. It's hard to get a sense of what's actually happening on the ground in Kursk region. Russian military bloggers and Russian civilians on social media have been posting less and less, and Ukrainian soldiers, for their part, have been told not to speak to the press, especially not on camera. But Ukraine's leaders have increasingly been open about what they plan to do here. There's been talk about humanitarian corridors for Russian civilians left behind in Kursk region to either get back to Russian-held territory or to flee here into Ukrainian-held territory, into Ukraine proper. And there's also been talk of creating military authorities, some kind of body that will govern the lives of those Russian civilians left behind in the Ukrainian-controlled part of Kursk region. As Russia struggles to come up with a response to this incursion into Kursk region, Ukraine shows no sign of a plan to bring its troops back over this border, back out of Russia into Ukraine.
I'm joined now by Mick. He's a retired Major General in the Australian Army. His latest book came out this week, In the War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire. He looks at what shaped Ukrainian and Russian strategy leading up to the war and how both sides have adapted their tactics, organizations, operational approaches and strategic foundations throughout the conflict. Welcome to the day, Mr. Ryan. It's great to have you on the show. Now, whatever Ukraine is trying to achieve with the Kursk offensive, what does it mean for the status quo of the war?
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. I think what Ukraine has tried to do and probably has achieved here is it has actually changed the status quo of the war. For a lot of people, both in Ukraine and beyond, the war had drifted into somewhat, not quite a stalemate, but it wasn't moving quickly. Ukraine can't afford that forever, and it wants to get this war over. It wants to beat the Russians, and this is their big swing in an attempt to change the status quo of the war.
How risky is this maneuver? Because, of course, they've moved equipment and troops from elsewhere in Ukraine. And what are the potential gains for Ukraine here?
Well, both sides at the moment are in some peril. The Ukrainians in the Donbass, particularly on the Pokrovsk front, are really facing a dangerous defensive campaign there where the Russians are advancing, but they are making progress in Kursk. On the other side, the Russians are in a very dangerous position in Kursk whilst taking ground in the Donbass. What we will see at some point is one side will blink, one side will decide it cannot take the pain that it is bearing at one point of the battlefield, and it will have to shut down its offensive to deal with a defensive battle.
What side do you think will blink first? You've watched this conflict unfold for the past 2 years.
Well, one of the things about war is you just can't predict what will happen, and even having watched it very closely, I don't think anyone can predict with any great accuracy which side will blink first. I certainly hope it's the Ukrainians. And the Russians appear to be in much bigger trouble than the Ukrainians are at this point in time. The Ukrainians have seized the momentum in this war.
Why do you think Ukraine was able to seize the momentum and grab Russian territory so quickly and seemingly without great difficulty?
Well, what they've done is been able to develop and implement a deception plan focused not just on the Russians, but a lot of people in the West who are watching this war. So we didn't see the preparations for this offensive. I think most of us thought that Ukraine would be doing major offensives next year, not this year. So they've been able to very successfully concentrate a force whilst deceiving the Russians about Ukrainian intentions. And most importantly, they were able to achieve surprise, which in the modern world is very difficult to do.
What does the Kursk offensive tell you about the ability of the Ukrainian forces to adapt to changing situations?
Well, it tells us they've learnt a lot from their 2023 failed counter-offensive, lots and lots of ways. First and foremost, the use of experienced formations in this offensive, whereas in the 2023 counter-offensive they used a lot of green brigades. But also this time they've attacked the Russians where they're weak rather than where they were strong in 2023. And they've also used a lot of electronic warfare and air defence assets this time that they didn't have last year. So they've learnt a lot, they've adapted since 2023, and that is causing the Russians a lot of problems.
Let's talk about the Russians and how they have adapted, because in ballpark figures, Ukraine has now seized in the past week roughly the same amount of Russian territory as Russia has in Ukraine since the start of the year. And in that time, you recently wrote, Russia suffered over 180,000 casualties. What do you read into that about Russia's ability to learn and adapt to a changing battlefield and maybe even a changing opponent?
Well, the Russians have certainly learned and adapted since the beginning of the war. And one of their adaptations is to simply just throw soldiers at the problem. Their meat tactics is an adaptation since the beginning of the war. That's what they've used to advance in the Donbass. It's what they continue to do in the Donbass. The real question is, how long can Russia continue to throw away so many lives for such small advances? No one really has a good answer for that question at this point in time.
Now, this offensive has, within Russia, of course, caused much nervousness. People have been displaced for the first time since the start of this war within Russia. How big a factor do you think that is?
Well, it's one of the designs of an offensive like this. Offensives into enemy territory are designed to cause panic amongst both soldiers and civilians, and both of those panicking have an impact on the political system. There is already pressure on Putin to do something about this. He's clearly not been able to do that just yet. So surprise, shock action, and these kind of offensives and the rapid movement that the Ukrainians are achieving are designed to cause this kind of panic in the enemy.
You're one of arguably many military analysts following this war very closely. I'd like to know how much this war, and maybe even, the twist that we've seen in the past couple of days, changed your perception of modern warfare.
There's not a lot of new things that are occurring in this war. I think things like uncrewed systems and the meshing of different sensors is probably a newer development, but there's a lot of old things that we've seen in this war that are continuities from previous conflicts. Whether it's the use of armour or firepower, but most importantly, war is a human endeavour and it requires good leadership from good people, and we've seen that from the Ukrainians.
That was Mick, author of The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire. Such a pleasure to get your insights and speak to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.